Hi, and welcome to afx215 Class 2. This week we're going to take it a little easier and work on this shot. Now, the beginning plate looked more like this. We have a tank that wasn't able to move under its own power on the day they shot it, but how cool that they got it at all, right? So, in order to complete this shot, we're going to be looking at roto combined with tracking. Now, I know there was an excellent roto course taught here at FX PhD in After Effects. And so what we'll be focusing on here is how you can use things like tracking and corner pinning in order to really save yourself a lot of grief with a shot like this. And you'll see what the issues are as we get into it. So let's get started. First thing to do with this shot is eliminate the camera motion in order to create the beginnings of the clean plate on the grassy area over here. This is After Effects CS55, so there is a tool to do this that's brand new. By choosing Stabilize Motion, I get Warp Stabilizer, and I can switch the result from smooth to no motion. And that is now working to analyze the shot in order to lock it off. And you can see the progress up here. It's going pretty fast, allowing me to talk over it as I go. Now, normally, no motion is something you would use when there was no intended camera motion at all. Here we've got a bit of a nodal pan, and that is not ideal. It's a better bet to use no motion if you were just hand-holding and trying to keep the camera right on something and just couldn't quite manage it. And so now it's done stabilizing. You notice the scale up. You can see over here that it's scaled up 106.7%. And that's just so that you don't have gaps around the edges of the image. The result is a little odd. There's some strange wobbling happening up here. But the real problem with this approach for what I want to do is I have no way now to reverse this and restore the motion. If I use the U key, Uber key, no keyframes, and UU, there is very little that I can tweak that has been adjusted. In fact, the only thing that's been adjusted is my original choice to use no motion. So Warp Stabilizer is really cool to actually basically create a whole new plate shot. But in this case, it's not going to do what I can do the old school way, like in Chapter 8 of After Effects Studio Techniques. So let's get at the slightly kludgier but highly useful method that I'm going to show you now. How do I stabilize a shot the old way? Well, they've taken away the old stabilized motion control and devoted it to Warp Stabilizer. That leaves me with track motion, which brings up the tracker panel. If I choose stabilize motion here, that's still going to bring up Warp Stabilizer. So I don't want that. Instead, I'll choose the track that was created again and change the track type to stabilize. I'm going to go ahead and stabilize position and rotation, 2 points. Now, in order to track this, I'm going to actually go in reverse in order to get here where there's the least amount of trackable area. So this is what I want to stabilize. So I can focus my points over here. And I'll just take track point 1, move it down to that little bit of detail right there. And I'm not going to do these side by side because I have so little space to work with. I'll do them top and bottom, just as good. And that's the tilde key that's toggling between those views. Now we'll track in reverse. So somewhere right about there, we're about to run right off the edge of the frame. So I stopped it, I think, just before we did. Let's see if I got it. Yeah, we're still good. If you didn't, what you'd need to do is twirl down your keyframes and delete the bad ones here. But I'm going to show you a trick whereby you're not stuck with a stabilize if this happens. And this is a very little known feature. I've seen people teaching courses at FX PhD where they recommend pairing together 2 sets of tracks when you're working with this, but you don't have to do that. You select the track point like that and hold down the Option key. Make sure you're on that crosshair, the 4-sided arrow, and just move this over to a new track point like that. Now I'll do the same for this one. Doesn't really matter if they correspond to the old ones. It helps if they're roughly similar. And now I'm going to continue the track to the end. Now let's just take a look here. Under Feature Center, if I bring up the graph editor, you see the pop right there in the motion. It's very clear. But if we look at Attach Point instead, there's no pop. So by holding in the Option key, I eliminated the transition for the attach point. And the attach point is what counts when I go ahead and click Apply. Let's look at the result. So the result has this part of the frame going all over the place, but the part that counts now is well stabilized, and I am good to go to the next step. So now let's create a new patch of grass to cover that chain. For that, I brought in the first and last frame only of the frame sequence. You could also freeze frame on a pre-comp, but this way seems more straightforward. So I'll just add in frame 1, and you'll see no change. The difference is that now the whole scene is just a still. So I'm going to call this patch grass and open it up in a layer view. So what I can do is use the clone tool to just quickly fix this up. And I'm sure this isn't your favorite thing to watch, but let's see how quick and dirty we can get away with here. Go like that. What I like to do with the clone tool is kind of do it wrong on the first pass. I mean, not ridiculously wrong, but just not worry too much. That was too far. We can go to about there. Try that again. Let's see. I'm going to go for that same spot. There to there. Obviously, you see some repetition. We can cover our tracks, however. Let me just keep going. From there to there. And fill in some of that right there. And I'll take some bigger clumps to just cover the evident patterns that I revealed before. Cover that up as well, but I better get a different source to do it. Okay. A couple more things to cover up, but for the most part, we're good. Let's just call that a good starting point. Maybe I'll finish the chain over here as well. Okay. If the repetitions that are left in there bug me later, this is non-destructive, so no problem. But for now, we're done. And the other thing I'll do is just mask it out. So just to cover the area with the chain. Like that. Okay, let's take a look at that result. All right, there's one little bit of mismatch in there, and I might be able to help this by just doing a couple things. One is, now notice if I move this, it's changing the area that was cloned. That's one thing about using the mask tool and the clone tool together. So actually, I think I'll take the approach of feathering this quite a bit. See if that helps. All right, it's not perfect, but it may be good enough to get us started. I think I'd like to avoid the areas that are blowing, and what I may have to do to work around, you see the problem here is that it's masking out my cloned area. So in fact, what I might want to do here is actually pre-comp, and I'm going to do it in a specific way. I'll take the mask and cut it. The paint effect is still applied, and I'm just going to pre-comp the patch grass. Pre-comp. And I'm going to move all attributes. Then I'll reapply the mask. Okay. So that's a start there. It'll be adjusted more later. Next thing is to deal with this tank. I'm going to bring in a new copy of the source. And for this next piece, it'll be helpful to use RotoBrush to just isolate the nose of the tank. Now, I'll just label this tank nose, and I inadvertently started typing and put in a bunch of keyboard shortcuts. So by double clicking, I can get access to RotoBrush. Now, RotoBrush is another tool that its title is actually too grandiose for what it does, but it's really good for a situation like this where actually what we want is a really quick and dirty, basically junk mat. And so all I have to do, that not the clone tool, but the RotoBrush tool, is draw here on the front, and I'll get a good bit of the nose. And that looks pretty good. I think I want just that last little bit right there. And I'm going to go ahead and roll the dice and see what I get. It'll help if I close these other windows to get a little more width. There we go. So by pressing the space bar, I can watch RotoBrush over time and see how well it's doing. And it looks like it's actually going to do just a fine job here of what I need, which is this leading edge where the chain isn't currently blocked out by that grass layer that I just created. So as long as it's getting all of the chain that's not over the open grass, that's all I need. The rest of the edges just don't matter. And that's looking like it's going to hold up pretty good. I think right there where I saw the mat creeping, I can just add one more RotoBrush keyframe right there. And that might be all I need. It's just to compensate for that blade of grass. Let's see if any others like that come up. I realize that this is a lot like watching paint dry, but many of you may not have used RotoBrush in this way. I think a lot of people have abandoned RotoBrush because, again, the title makes you think, oh, I use it for roto. And as you can see, this mat is not really suitable for a full extraction of the tank. And in fact, to do that would start to get really tricky because of all these shadows and blades of grass and everything. But that's not what we're after here. All I'm really asking it to do is just find the leading edge between where the tank and the grass are, and it's actually doing quite a fine job of that for what we're going to end up doing. So there is a lot of matte boil, but it doesn't really matter if you just focus on that chain. And in fact, I can get rid of some of that by just saying refine matte. Now, having done that, I'm going to go ahead and freeze it. That way, After Effects won't continually recalculate it. Okay, that operation is done, and it updates relatively quickly, being frozen. So now, let's see where we're at. It looks a little messed up. We can do something about that. At this point, I'm going to add the motion to that little grass patch so that we can see it working. To that, I'll close the motion trackers, but I want this anchor point data right here. I'll just copy it. I'm going to go back to the first frame. I'll create a new null. And I'll call this track null and paste that data. So now if I look at the anchor point, same data. I'll also create a camera. I like to just leave it at 50 millimeters. That's the default, and call it track cam. I'll reveal the parenting column with Shift F4 and just parent that camera to that null. I'd like a new version of the plate without the motion. So let's just find that and pull it in. So we'll call this one plate tracked, or even stabilized would be more appropriate. And then this one will just be called plate. Now, simply by taking the grass patch and making it 3D, I get all that motion. Let's check it out. That's looking pretty good, other than this plate that's being revealed back here. As a quick fix, I'll just duplicate this layer and go to the end frame and move one of them over. Yeah, it's probably going to blow the gag. I better get rid of that hard seam right there. So in fact, what I can do is change this mask a bit. Like that, and move this one above. Okay, so now we just have to focus on that nose of the tank that we just isolated. The next step is to now stabilize that tank so that it's locked off. And I'll do that in a pre-comp. Command-Shift-C, move all attributes, and this will be tank nose roto. And I did not click open. Okay, so now to stabilize this shot, this should be a cinch. We already know how to do it. I'll just pick one of these nice details on the front of the tank like that. Roll it out. Done, no problem. I can change it to a stabilize after the fact and still apply it. Having stabilized the nose of the tank, I'm now going to mask out just the area where the chain is covering the front, the dark area of that tank. Now, masks and rotobrush don't get along well together. So this next section you have to pay really close attention because this is where After Effects can get a little gnarly. I am going to pre-comp, and when I say that I mean in comparison to a node-based compositor. So I'll call this tank nose locked and move all attributes into that. What I meant to do, though, was keep a copy. So I'll just grab one, stick it in here, and so now I still have the stabilized source. And in fact, on that one, I'm just going to remove these paint and rotobrush effects. So I've got that to work with. I can turn it off right now. Okay. Now, let's just focus in on that chain. The chain in this area at the front of the tank is much lighter than what's behind it, so great. All I need to do, in fact, I'll go back to frame 1, is actually I'm going to mask out the area with the chain, just so I'm focused only on that. I don't have to be exact here because I'm going to be replacing the area around it as well. Okay, so I'm focused on that, at least at the beginning frame. Let's see where we go. Set a mask path keyframe there. Then at the end, I'm going to have to just move this a bit. Might be simpler if I don't have it turned on. And let's just see in the middle. I'll create another keyframe here in the middle. In fact, I'm going to get a little sloppy deliberately and overlap this area that I know I'm replacing later. Okay, so that's my area of focus. I'm going to turn the mask back on. And to that, I'll apply keying extract. The way extract works is like this. There's a histogram with all of the visible pixels. By bringing the top hash down, I begin to create transparency where the lighter pixels were. Then I can create threshold by bringing the bottom one back. Now, at the moment, I'm working kind of blind. So what I think I'd like to do is actually move this layer so it's kind of underneath, like that. And I'm not going to worry about all the surroundings just yet. Now, I know that I have to come down pretty far and probably not do too much thresholding, but luckily it does look like it's going to work. Great. Now, how to apply it just to this area? Well, one way to do it is actually to invert this and apply it as an alpha matte just for this background layer. Now if I do that, the other thing I want to do is bring another one of these down, turn off alpha for that. And just reset the position. Okay. Now I'm blowing the gag a little bit here because you can see the repeat pattern, and also we got a seam opening up there. Let's see if I can just fix that. Excuse me, I moved the wrong one. Looks like it's this mask that's part of the problem. So I better be a little more generous there at the end with the area that it covers. And then, because I'm seeing the chain shadow again, I got to keep moving here. I'll probably want to create a new kind of shadow to cover that up over here. Let's just flash it and see what we're dealing with. Well, I think I might be able to get away with that. Maybe. I don't like that too much right there. I could mess around with scaling it and so on, but I'll go with that as a starting point. Now remember, I've already taken care of everything out here with the chain and the shadow. And to clearly see that, you can just go grab that rotor brush effect again and reapply it. Now we're in Mocha to just take care of the angle change on the front of the tank here. I'm going to keep this really simple. Again, there have been whole other courses here at afx215, well, one of them, dealing with this. Let's close that up with the C key, and looks like I'm scaled to a different monitor size. Okay, that was pretty straightforward. The only concern I have is right at the end where that tire got in there. Let's just see about that surface. So I'm going to change this so that it's just around the area we want. And more or less rectilinear. Okay, and let's see if it sticks. Okay. Export the tracking data. Now, I'm going to go ahead and use Red Giant Warp in this case, and I'll explain why in a moment. So that is the export method that I'm going to use, and I even already tried this once, so just call this one cpin01. I'll take that Mocha track and apply it over this corner of this tank. Before I do that, I will restore the motion, the original motion, to what I've already done here. Same process as before. New null. Can be called tracker null. And that one is going to get the anchor point data. I just pasted it. There it is. New camera. Tracker cam. So this is a separate set of motion data than in the main scene, and that's why I'm doing this again. These two can be 3D, and do I even need this one? Yeah, okay. For the back layer, what I could do is just pull the plate back in. So instead of having this motion from the anchor point animation on it and then removing it by canceling it out with the camera, I'm just going to take that roto brush and put it here and call this one plate selected. I can turn that back one off. Not really a big difference, but there might be a little bit of fine pixel detail lost by running it through that whole system. I'm not sure that there is. Any case, now I have the moving front of the tank back again, and in fact I can go back to the main shot. One thing I added here is just a little fill for the shadow, that gap that was in there before. You can just see it here. And I did that the old-fashioned way. I just tracked the plate right off of an object right near that gap where I needed to cover the chain, and then just use a solid. Very simple. Now, back to Mocha. So I made myself a clean plate, and actually, maybe it helps if I solo it. It is done with Paint and After Effects. You could, of course, do this in Photoshop or wherever you like. And I just took the chain out and cleaned this up around the hook there and held out an area just to the outside of it where I'm going to reveal all the other paint work that's been done there. So really, I'm just interested in that one little square where I was working in Mocha. To apply that, I'm going to use RG corner pin, which is part of the Red Giant Warp package. So this is a third-party plugin. You don't have to use this plugin, but in this case I thought I would show it because let me start out with what you would get with regular old After Effects corner pinning, which you can do the equivalent of right here. Now this is kind of nice that it brings in the corner pin from Mocha through a UI as opposed to the After Effects way, which is like copy and paste. But by default, of course, it uses the full frame, and I just want to use the area around that nose. Now I could create a new subcomp with just that, but the nice thing that this does for me, if I go to original and say show from pins, what I can do is instead of framing it around the entire shot, just frame it around the area that I want to pin from, which is the same area where my surface was in Mocha. So I'm just going to guess to begin with that it was that. I'll say both pins warp, and I need to say crop to pins and unsolo it. All right, now I can interactively just kind of fix that. So that it more or less looks right in there. Could be something like that. It's not perfect, but we're counting on people not to study this too carefully, and it wouldn't take me that much time to improve on it. At this stage we have a take, and it's really just a question of whether my quick and dirty work down here holds up or whether it needs more refinement. And if it does, that's certainly possible. If it doesn't, then we found a quick way to just get good enough roto done on this shot. I do notice something very strange happening over here, actually on both sides with the lens. Those weren't something we even got into. So I could see a take two of this shot going a bit further to clean up this shot, but we no longer have, obviously, the one giveaway that made the shot not work. And so this is a successful take one. I will see you on the forums and look forward to moving on to another shot next week. Let's talk about the Arbiter Challenge. This is going to be a fun one. First of all, pull in the elements, and you'll notice that background and foreground are living together in one folder. Now, really any other compositing app would have no problem with this. This file browser doesn't see them that way, but here's a little tip. If you select all of those files and say multiple sequences, you can at least bring them both in. There's a really nice script by Lloyd Alvarez up at AE Scripts that does a much better job of dealing with sequences and loading them and updating them than you can do by default in here. So the shot itself, we have a static view of an office. In fact, that appears to be a completely locked shot, and this shot of the Arbiter. And what's happening here is he is decloaking. Now, this is a key point of the movie, is that this suit renders its wearer invisible, but it's highly dangerous, toxic, World War II, steampunk type of technology going on here. And that's going to be key to this effect. So the challenge is actually to create the decloaking effect. Whoa. Now, to put you a little bit at ease getting started with that, let's take a look at some reference. So first of all, the director provided a couple of examples up on the web that really will help you get started with what you probably already can think of ways to do. That one's kind of fun. And here on YouTube, of course, is the YouTube type of effects demo. Now, from there, the director also provided a bunch of other files, reference, kind of inspiration for what's going to be going on here. And in a moment, I'm going to show these then taken into the concept art level. So we actually have a lot of material to work with. You can treat these pretty loosely. Nothing here literally needs to be in there. It's just some inspiration for what some of the looks might be about. And I'll have more to say about some specifics of how it works and so on. So it seems clear there's going to be some bent light happening in here. And then there were some early ideas that came through here. The visible human stuff also relates to something we're going to see in a moment from knowing. So just keep in mind that invisibility might also include a kind of organic component like this. And if we look at these shots from knowing, you can see how they were implementing that kind of idea. Again, this is a little too literal and specific for what we're doing, but it's just one more idea that can go in there along with these kind of energy effects. Now let's take a look at the concept work. So this is pretty cool. This is the cloaking effect happening in transition. I can zoom in here. And this is something the director is actually pretty happy with as far as concept work goes. So you can make your own associations about what you're seeing here. There's definitely something photochemical happening and emphasis on the chemical. This effect should feel primitive and dangerous, like something you would expect from the 1940s. Not that you would expect any of this to be possible at all in the 1940s, but considering that it's also the decade that brought us the atomic bomb, you're thinking along the right lines if you kind of think that way. And so we see here that there's some vapor, a lot of bending of light, and you see some of the elements that we were just looking at incorporated into this work pretty nicely, I think. So here's just, again, a close-up of the couple of frames that are most key. And then for the actual cloaking, for the decloaking, let's just take a look at this sequence. So there are really three effects actually to be worked on here. One is the cloaking. One is actually the invisibility effect, which is how we see him when he's cloaked. This might actually be a little bit stronger. We're already seeing the decloaking here, but there's going to be something there like we saw in that earliest web reference. Some indication that he's there. And then this is the stuff that is working particularly well for the decloaking, which is the moment where he first bursts through and then going down to here where he's really trying to fully form and there's a lot of energy and so on happening. Now I'm sure you're asking yourself, that's all fine and good for stills, but how the heck would I do that in After Effects? Well, let's take a look at some specific notes. So for the cloaking effect, here's some of how it works. There's a backpack with an oscillator. This thing starts to spin and throw off a lot of heat and embers, sparks, that kind of thing. So that would indicate that there's some particle work here along with some heat distortion. There are some clues as to how to get started with those in After Effects Studio Techniques. In fact, there's a whole breakdown of how to do the heat distortion. And so that's one place to start. So a lot of the ingredients are there for you. The emboss effect that you saw there, that's something that seems to be happening in the translucency. And this notion of there being light caustics happening kind of around him. So glass meets caustics and flickering. And then there's this notion of making each frame unique. So almost like a kind of a violence to the motion. He says organic, but I would also say chemical is pretty key there. It's pretty volatile feeling. When he's invisible, here's the note. This is almost a separate effect, and actually one you could just take on without worrying about cloaking or decloaking. Thinking about bending of light and effects that you might have seen in other movies that achieve that. And please, I encourage you to share any reference or inspiration you see on the forums. And then for the decloaking effect, this is the one we saw that long sequence of images for, but it actually happens a lot faster. The director refers to a couple of images that I called out in that sequence that are really key. So this is obviously pretty challenging stuff. And it's very important to the movie Project Arbiter that the Arbiter effect be as cool as possible. So as we roll this challenge out on round one, this effect is still very much up for grabs, and you could be the one to solve it, or at least partially. Now, I and the team, nobody is expecting you to just take a default install of After Effects and throw a few effects on there and you're done. Although, I will be focusing myself on picking up on things that are possible to do relatively simply, and Heat Ripple is one of those. Now, obviously, if you crack this, not only is it a big credit in the film, it gives you a lot of street cred here on FX PhD, but I would really encourage you, even if you don't think you're going to take this thing all the way through, but you have an idea, a concept, a thought, throw it out there. I have a good war story to share with you from Day After Tomorrow, where we were really stuck trying to do the supercell, the huge storm cloud, procedurally. It was kind of breaking what Maya could do at that point. We were getting really bogged down. The shots were way behind, and I threw out something that I had actually learned at the orphanage years before, which was to basically use mesh distortions to move cloud-like objects. And we actually ended up solving it that way by building up a little system. Stu ended up really, taking it home, but by throwing out a daily that just had that idea in it, I think I helped spark going in that direction. And that's totally valid here. If you just have a concept for one piece of this, well, let's get it up there. Let's see it. Now, obviously, if your work is committed and you are interested in iterating shots with this effect, that will be part of the Special Ops program for this course. So look for a thread having to do with the challenge on the forum soon, and I really look forward to seeing your contributions up there. We'll revisit this with the director later in the term.